Hey everyone, this is Glenn Greenwald. Welcome to a new episode of System Update here on our home on Rumble. I want to examine the latest conduct and career trajectory of a particular member of Congress named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who represents New York's 14th Congressional District as a Democrat. She's affectionately known to most of us with her endearing nickname AOC, and the reason I want to examine AOC's most recent behavior and how it reflects her career trajectory is not because she in and of herself is an important and influential political figure. In fact, the exact opposite is true. She's really become basically a non-entity in Congress. She has almost no effect on the enactment of legislation, on political debates. She really has kind of disappeared into this bizarre cultural celebrity where she still wields a lot of cachet on social media, but in terms of any actual role in the political landscape, she is essentially a non-entity. But I nonetheless want to examine not just her behavior, but the behavior of her fellow members of the so-called squad over the last 48 hours, because I think it reflects a great deal about the political movement that has followed her, which is the movement in the United States that, accurately or not, likes to call itself the political left. Now, to set the stage for that examination, I want to just briefly explain what happened. Most of you already probably know, but there was a vote last night in the House of Representatives on whether to send an additional $40 billion of American money to fuel the war in Ukraine. And I will explain exactly what happened there, but AOC's role in that vote is particularly interesting to me, in part because I've actually followed AOC's career for a long time. Many of you may not know that when she was running in 2018 as a challenger to the longtime Democratic incumbent Joseph Crowley, who was a favorite of Nancy Pelosi's, he was part of the House leadership. He was one of those members of Congress who barely anyone knew his name, and yet he exercised an inordinate amount of power. He's one of those guys who only operated in the back rooms of the Capitol through lobbyist money and the like. I don't think a single one of his constituents would have known him if they had bumped into him on the street. In fact, he barely even bothered to pretend that he lived in his district. He was one of those kinds of people who exercise a great deal of power completely separate and apart from the lives of his constituents. He would more or less win an election every year because nobody would challenge him as a Democrat, and the Democrat automatically won. And suddenly AOC challenged him in 2018, and no one even paid any attention to her, even on the left. She was a completely unknown political figure. Very few people paid attention to that race. I actually was one of the people who paid attention to that race, and I can't take credit for that. It was because my very talented colleague at the time, Ryan Grimm, who's the Washington bureau chief of The Intercept, and pays close attention to the happenings of left-wing politics. I remember very well in the middle of 2018, he messaged me and said, there's a woman who's challenging a long-time corporate incumbent in Queens, and I think you should look into her because I think you would like her and find her interesting. And he was right. I looked into her. At the time, she was really positioning herself, much like Bernie Sanders did in 2016, not as a Democrat, but as somebody who wanted to challenge the establishment wings of both parties on the ground that they were actually had far more in common than they had differences, and that the only way to achieve anything politically was to challenge the political ruling class, the establishment wings, in both political parties, which is a prong of my worldview for a long time. And so to hear someone like her, who clearly had political talent, regardless of what else you thought about her when you looked at her, articulating this worldview, actually did generate a lot of interest on my part in her campaign and ultimately support for her campaign. And because of my interest in her campaign, I think a lot of people have forgotten about this. I actually interviewed her. She gave me all the time I needed. I think it ended up being a 1 hour long interview. It was a very in-depth interview that covered a wide range of topics. And you can get the tenor of what that interview was from the very first part. Hi, I'm Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept, and my guest today is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a first-time candidate running in the Democratic Party primary, challenging the 10-term Democratic congressman incumbent, Joseph Crowley, in New York's 14th Congressional District, which covers Queens and
the Bronx. Thanks so much for taking the time out from the campaign trail to talk to me today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Glenn.
She was so delighted to talk to me. I don't think she would be now, but you see how she exuded such charm and such glee just because you were thanking her for joining her for an interview. And so we covered a lot of ground. One of the things she told me was when I asked her whether she would support Nancy Pelosi as House Speaker or leader of the Democratic caucus and Steny Hoyer as her lieutenant, despite being in that position for many, many terms. She told me absolutely not. She thought and it was urgent that there be a change in leadership and that she would not vote for either of them. And the first thing she did when she got to Washington after winning that race was voted for Nancy Pelosi for House Speaker and Steny Hoyer for House Majority Leader, even though they both did have, or Pelosi at least had a challenge, albeit one from the right, but one from a younger generation. She was very critical of identity politics, telling me that she thought identity politics was often a deceitful and fraudulent way that the ruling class could recruit people who look different because they were of a different race or gender or sexual orientation. And in fact, they were just there to create the facade of diversity. And in reality, their function was to carry forth status quo policy. She called them Trojan horses. We talked a lot about foreign policy. So I've been watching Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's political trajectory and campaign for quite a long time, as you can see, going back. Now, what happened over the last couple of days was amazing. Back in April, on April 28th, Joe Biden sent a request to Congress asking for $33 billion more to send to the war in Ukraine. And by which I mean he wants $33 billion to send to the coffers of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and the CIA to purchase military equipment and weapons, including ones that the United States is low on because we've depleted our stockpile by sending so much weaponry to Ukraine. So we wanted an additional $33 billion on top of the $14 billion we've already spent just 10 weeks into this war. It was only February 24th when Russia invaded. So after just 10 weeks of this war, Biden was asking for $33 billion on top of $14 billion he's already spent, which is a total of $47 billion. And the amazing part about that is U.S. officials are saying that they both predict and obviously hope that this will be a war that resolves itself not in a matter of months, but years. So this $48 billion is just the first partial investment in this war. If it's true that it'll go on for years, we're easily going to blow past hundreds of billions of dollars and probably get to a trillion dollars fairly quickly for a war that we claim isn't ours in a country that in Washington, people, including Barack Obama, have been saying for many years, Ukraine is of vital interest to Russia, but not a vital interest to the United States. Why would it be? It has no geostrategic importance to the United States. It has no resources that the United States needs. It was Obama who always said, of course, we would never confront or risk war with Moscow over the borders of eastern Ukraine or Crimea because it matters so much to them, but not very much to us. And so Biden's request for $33 billion more on top of the $14 billion was extraordinary. And the reaction of the establishment wings of both parties was completely identical and united. They looked at it and they said, $33 billion, that's not enough. We want to give $40 billion. And they very quickly united and agreed on $40 billion. They created an accelerated legislative path to ensure that it passes very quickly so it can get to Biden's desk so we can send another $40 billion in military equipment and the like. Some of it's for humanitarian aid and economic reconstruction, but most of it for military equipment to continue to fuel the war in Ukraine without any discussion, as I noted in my article of yesterday, about who benefits. How do American citizens benefit from this war in Ukraine or from the $48 billion that Biden was proposing, $47 billion proposing to spend already 10 weeks into the war? What benefits do American citizens get from that? No debate or discussion of that at all. but the Congress just immediately said $33 billion is enough. Let's just arbitrarily throw $7 billion on top of it. And the two parties were in such agreement that they didn't even need to debate it. They were just eager and ready to vote. Now, just to give you an idea for how things have been proceeding, since the war began, the Biden administration, every 2 to 3 weeks, has just been announcing seemingly random but very significant amounts that it intended to send to Ukraine pursuant to an authorization that quietly occurred in Congress at the beginning of the war for $3.5 billion that Biden was authorized to spend. So you see the pattern there. February 26th, Biden approves $350 million in military aid. March 16th, 3 weeks later, Biden announces $800 million in military aid for Ukraine. March 30th, 2 weeks later, Ukraine to receive an additional $500 million in aid from the U.S. April 12th, 2 weeks later, U.S. to announce $750 million more in weapons for Ukraine. May 6th, Biden announces a new $150 million weapons package for Ukraine. And what had actually happened was, after that $3.5 billion was quickly depleted and exhausted, the House and then the Senate went back in early March and authorized another $13.6 billion for the government to spend in Ukraine, which is how we got to $14 billion that's already gone and spent out the door less than 3 months into this war. Now, here you see from the New York Times on April 28th that reported on Biden's request for $33 billion more, some additional background, basically saying that he's seeking $33 billion. And as I said, the House immediately said, we want to give you more, $40 billion. And last night, because of the accelerated schedule, I mean, when does anything in Congress happen that quickly? You have Biden on April 28th asking for the first time for $33 billion. Less than 2 weeks later, May 10th, the House passes $40 billion bill and is going to now send it to the Senate. And here you see the CNN report on that vote. And this is the part that's extraordinary. The Democratic-led House of Representatives voted 368 to 57 on Tuesday evening to pass a roughly $40 billion bill to deliver aid to Ukraine as it continues to face Russia's brutal assault. There's CNN editorializing, justifying it, but that's the breakdown of the vote. All 57 votes in opposition. 57 House members voted no, we don't want to send $40 billion more to Ukraine under these conditions. All 57 of the ones who said no were Republicans, which conversely means that not a single Democrat, not one, in the entire House of Representatives, including the Squad and AOC and Ilhan Omar and Cori Bush and Ayanna Pressley, and none of them, Jamal Bowman, none of them voted no against this $40 billion. It was a unanimous yes in defense of this war policy. Now, here's the New York Times report that provides additional background about what is happening politically, where the two parties are completely united in lockstep support for this war. Now, at the beginning of the war, there was a narrative that congealed that more or less everybody, with a very few exceptions, a handful of dissidents who were instantly dismissed as Russian agents or pro-Kremlin propagandists or traitors, that more or less everybody accepted, which is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was its fault and its fault only. The U.S. and NATO played no role in that invasion and provoking it, and that Russia was the aggressor and the wrong party, and Ukraine was the completely innocent victim. Now, even if you're somebody who believes, and a lot of people I respect believe that storyline, even if you're somebody who believes that and was horrified, as any healthy, decent person would be by the images we were seeing about the results of the war, they weren't anything unusual or aberrational for war. Every war contains that level of atrocity, but the media decided to show it to us as opposed to hide it from us, which normally happens with the war the U.S. or its allies fight. In this case, we were seeing constant imagery. We were getting very angry, very upset, a lot of emotion. I did a video right at the beginning in that first or second week saying, because of this intense emotion that's being generated around the war, it's very likely, in fact, almost inevitable, that the U.S. government will not only be able to escalate its role in the war, but almost will be forced to by this extreme sentiment, anger over Russia, and this kind of extreme solidarity with Ukraine. I was recently in the US about 7 days ago, and in the places I visited, I saw way more Ukrainian flags in front of homes, flying on rooftops, in front of businesses than I did American flags. That's how strong these emotions are. And it was inevitable that it would lead to a rapid escalation. And I just showed you from a financial perspective how quickly U.S. investment in this war has escalated. We're now sending far more heavier weaponry. We're far more involved with boasting about how we're helping the Ukrainians target Russian assets. And now we're about to spend another $40 billion. So our role has rapidly escalated, but very few people have been willing to debate any of this because that early intensity of calling anybody who was even a little off key a traitor or treasonous or a Russian agent like Tulsi Gabbard and Tucker Carlson and many other people, just for asking whether we should be involved in this war, whether we're doing enough to diplomatically resolve it, created a climate where no one wanted to debate it. And so this escalation has all been happening very quietly, even though it's incredibly significant. So here's the New York Times after yesterday's House vote. Very bipartisan vote, passing $40 billion more, kind of giving a sense of the politics that's prevailing in Washington. Quote, the escalating brutality of the war in Ukraine has dampened voices on both the right and left, skeptical of the United States' involving itself in armed conflict overseas. So very few anti-war voices on either the right or the left, skeptical of the U.S. escalating involvement in this war on the other side of the world in a country that Washington has always said is not a vital interest of the United States. This dampening is, quote, fueling a rush by Congress to pour huge amounts of money into a potentially lengthy and costly offensive against Russia with few questions or reservations raised. This is the New York Times aptly describing in a news article the climate in Washington. Both parties are fully on board for escalation. Very few people are questioning it, and we're rushing headlong with very little questions being asked or reservations raised. Quote, under pressure to present a united front as Putin forces carried out a campaign of atrocities across Ukraine, lawmakers in both political parties who have previously railed against skyrocketing military budgets and entanglements and intractable conflicts abroad have gone largely silent about what is fast becoming a major military effort drawing on American resources. The House on Tuesday night passed a $40 billion military and humanitarian aid package for Ukraine, and I went over the vote already. That total, roughly $53 billion over 2 months, goes beyond what President Biden requested and is poised to amount to the largest foreign aid package to move through Congress in at least 2 decades. Now, before I put the issue of how much money the United States is already spending 10 weeks into this war into critical context, let me just emphasize that unlike other U.S. wars where we rushed into them, we got American support, popular support, both parties on board, very little questioning allowed, in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Syria, only for the population 2 years later or 4 years later to 6 years later to start to ask, wait a minute, this war's still going on, all this money is flying out the door, who's benefiting from this? And then ultimately regretting it. At least in those wars, the U.S. was fighting countries that really weren't very powerful, that couldn't threaten the United States in any way. This war is so different and so much more dangerous because the country we're now vowing to destroy and defeat, basically admitting we're at war with them, albeit for the moment in a proxy war, is the single largest, has the single largest nuclear stockpile on the planet, even larger than the United States. It's talking about a completely new level of danger when the United States is directly engaging Russia. And the fact that there's virtually no debate, just in and of itself, should be extremely disturbing no matter what your views are on this war. Now, to put the money into context, the passage of this $40 billion budget expenditure to Ukraine means that, as the New York Times says, it now means that just over 2 months, we've spent roughly $53 billion. $53 billion. First of all, the overall annual U.S. military expenditure is $770 billion. That's how much the U.S. spends on its military. That's 3 times more than the second highest military spender, which is China. And it's more than the next 13 countries combined. So we spend almost $1 trillion every year in our military. We're getting close to 10% of our overall military budget for 10 weeks of war in a war that we're not even fighting in Ukraine. Close to 10% of the military budget overall into this war just after 10 weeks. What's it going to be after a year? What percentage of our overall military budget will be poured into this war after a year, or 2 years, or 5 years? This $53 billion that we've already now allotted is more than the average amount that the United States spent every year for its own war in Afghanistan. Its own war in Afghanistan. On average, the United States, during the 20-year course of that war, spent $46 billion in defense of its own war. We're spending $53 billion, not in a year, but in 10 weeks on this other war in Ukraine. At least the war in Afghanistan had some kind of a pretense of self-defense. The argument at the beginning was, we're going to fight in Afghanistan because the Taliban harbored Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, which enabled them to attack the United States on 9/11. They wouldn't turn them over when we demanded of it. So in our own self-defense, we had to go and root out Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. That was at least a war of self-defense, ostensibly. And even there, we didn't spend nearly as much as we're spending on this war in Ukraine that nobody can cast as self-defense. No one thinks the Russian invasion of Ukraine poses a threat to the United States or a threat to the security of American citizens, and yet we're spending vastly, soon to be vastly more than our own war in Afghanistan. On top of that, this $53 billion that we've already spent just 10 weeks into the war is close to the total amount that Russia spends every year on its entire military budget, which is $69 billion roughly. So here we are trying to depict Russia as this grave existential threat, this rogue nation, like comparing it to Nazi Germany and Hitler ready to take over all of Europe, when in reality, the U.S. not only spends more than 10 times what Russia spends on its military each year, but we're close to exceeding, in just 10 weeks, spending on this war what Russia spends on its entire military. That's how gargantuan these sums are, even though they've received almost no debate, even though nobody's asking what's the impact on American citizens who are suffering so much at home. Now, the Times adds, this vote comes at a time when the two parties have been unable to reach agreement to invest in domestic programs. They include the extension of a tax credit that pulled millions of American children out of poverty, and even a pandemic response package to control the spread of the coronavirus, as Republicans and some Democrats raised concerns that such spending could exacerbate inflation and increase the federal deficit. As Mr. Biden's requests to Congress for money to fund the war effort have spiraled upward, leaders in both parties have largely refrained from questioning them. Instead, the packages have swelled to accommodate the two parties' competing priorities, with Republicans adding money for military assistance and Democrats insisting that be matched by an equal addition for humanitarian aid. Now, let's look at the specific votes of certain members of Congress. Here's the roll call vote from the last night's approval of $40 billion more, $7 billion more than even Joe Biden requested. And let's look at some of the yes votes. Here you see the title of the bill, Additional Ukrainian Supplemental Appropriations for Act of 2022. You have 368 yes votes, 57 nays, 5 not voting. Among the yeas, voting for $40 billion to send to Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and the CIA. There's money for the CIA in this bill, of course, is Ayanna Pressley, the member of the Squad, the progressive, revolutionary, leftist representative from Massachusetts, and Ilhan Omar, the hardcore, anti-imperialist representative from Minnesota, and Cori Bush, who wrote in on a protest movement in Ferguson against the police and American white supremacy and American power. And there's Rashida Tlaib, the same thing, a hardcore critic of American imperialism in the Middle East. And there's Jamal Bowman, part of the Squad. And here we have the aforementioned AOC, all yes votes. At a time when Americans are living below the poverty line by the millions, unable to buy insulin for them that have diabetes, forced to ration their own insulin in a way that often endangers their lives, diabetics, because the cost of insulin is too high and there's no government programs to help them. There are no jobs that help them get health insurance. 30 million Americans without health insurance, parents unable to send their kids to college, tens of thousands of businesses, small businesses, still shut down because of the lockdowns of COVID. Americans suffering in all sorts of ways. There's a supply chain problem that's preventing Americans from even buying baby formula. All of these members of the squad who claimed to run for office in devotion to the interest of the American working class and the American poor just voted yes to send $40 billion more to Raytheon and the CIA for the war in Ukraine. They share the exact same view as Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham and Sean Hannity and all of the warmongers, the traditional warmongers in both parties, Adam Smith and Adam Schiff and Kevin McCarthy and all of them, Mitch McConnell. She's on board with this, not just those people, but this policy. It's mind-boggling. And the amazing thing is not one of the 6 members of the squad, not one, has come out and explained their vote. Why did they vote for something so seemingly antithetical to their alleged political worldview and ideology? And the reason they haven't had to is because virtually nobody on the left cares that they did it. The left has almost, and by the left, I mean the sort of faction that calls itself the left. Real leftists don't consider them the left, but for all intents and purposes, the American left is defined by and led by Bernie Sanders and AOC and the squad. Those people are just, they have nothing to say about this escalating war in Ukraine that the Democratic president and the bipartisan unified wing of Congress are increasingly leading the United States into. And so they just got to vote with no explanation. Now, the idea that AOC is a fraud, that she routinely violates her own claimed ideology, that she's completely petrified of standing up to any real power in Washington, that she's only willing to have gestures of dissent when it makes no difference. This is very well established. I'll give you a couple of examples. Back in May of 2021, Nancy Pelosi demanded $2 billion more for the Capitol Police, even though the squad and other people in her party had spent 2020 chanting, defund the police, and posting all cops are bastards and the police are white supremacists and agents of white supremacy. For the police that protect the members of Congress, Nancy Pelosi wanted $2 billion more to enhance the surveillance authorities and the weaponry of the Capitol Police. And the squad told activists who were left-wing activists who were working against this bill, you know, the people who actually believed it when they were chanting defund the police and thought, like, of course you're not going to go chant defund the police and then spend $2 billion more on the police, the ones that protect you, while defunding the ones that protect working class people and people who don't have private security in Congress. Of course you're not going to do that. So the squad said, yeah, we as a group, all 6 of us, are going to vote no on Nancy Pelosi's bill. The reason they committed to voting no was because they thought the votes, their no votes wouldn't matter. They thought it would pass anyway because Pelosi would get enough yes votes from Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger in order to make sure it passed. Once the squad realized that if they followed through on their vow to vote no, Pelosi's demand would be thwarted, the bill wouldn't pass, 3 of them, including AOC, switch at the last minute their yes vote to present. And so the bill passed by 1 vote, 213 to 212. Had the 3 of them who vowed to vote no made good on their word, it would have failed. So here you see they were willing to vote no as long as it didn't matter and made no difference, and Pelosi got what she wanted anyway, so they could tell the left, oh, look, we tried to stop it, but we couldn't. Once they realized they really had the power to stop it, they were too scared to anger Pelosi. 3 of them, exactly the number needed, switched their votes from yes to present. and it enabled Pelosi to get what she wanted. You might recall the even more pathetic episode in September of 2021 when the House is going to vote on funding for Israel's Iron Dome. In fact, the House already funds Israel's Iron Dome, but they had used part of it because Gaza was shooting rockets. They wanted to replenish their stockpile, and Israel, instead of using their own money, which is quite ample, to buy their own supplements for the Iron Dome, even though many Israeli citizens live better lives than many, many Americans, they turned to the United States. They asked the United States to give them supplemental funding, billions of dollars. Obviously, it's been a long time cause on the left to support Palestinian rights and oppose Israeli occupation. So, of course, everyone assumed AOC was going to vote no. She did vote no. And then at the last minute, she changed her vote yet again to present. And then she proceeded to weep. Openly wept on the House floor, had to be comforted by one of her colleagues, as though the real victim in the Israeli-Palestine conflict is AOC. But there you see again, she was going to vote no until she realized that it made people angry, and then she again switched her vote to present. And then who could forget the magical moment last year in October of 2021, or in September 2021, when Americans were still locked down, schools were still closed because of the pandemic. People were still forced to wear masks. People were getting fired for not getting the vaccine. She decided to attend the Met Gala, the most flamboyant and gluttonous display of celebrity, glitter, and glamour and wealth that the United States has to offer. And she wore a gown, a very expensive, beautiful designer gown. And she has so little respect for her own followers that she figured, oh, just spray paint some left-wing slogan on the back, tax the rich, and my idiot followers will actually believe I've done something subversive by attending, that I'm not here to, have drinks with Beyonce and wallow in the glamour of celebrity culture. I'm actually here to fight for them, for a socialist agenda, by saying tax the rich on the back, as though the liberal celebrities at the Met Gala would have been offended in any way. But what was amazing was, here you see that she and her boyfriend, while they were getting ready for the Met Gala, were not wearing a mask. There she is. There's her face, totally unmasked, indoors, not outdoors, indoors. And this team of servants are all attending to her gown, to her hair, to her makeup, to her nails, to her feet, her toes. They have to wear masks, but she does not, because she's at the top of the caste system, and she likes it that way. So all of this has shown for a long time what AOC is. So that's why I was saying I don't want to look at what AOC did just to further show that AOC is a fraud. Everyone knows that already. No one needs to hear that. But what it does show is the state of the American left, and how the only place where dissent is permitted to be heard, and where you find no votes against U.S. war policy in Ukraine, is on the American right. If you want to go on television and oppose the U.S. role in Ukraine, there's only two places you can go in prime time. The 8 o'clock program on Fox News, hosted by Tucker Carlson, the 10 o'clock hour, hosted by Laura Ingraham. There's a couple other Fox shows like Jesse Waters and Dan Bongino, who also have some dissent. But for prime time, it's just those two shows. I wish that weren't the case. I wish there were more places in the media, even where hosts support the policy, but were willing to air dissent, but they don't. So the no votes all came from the American right, from House Republicans. The only places on TV you can go to hear dissent over the escalating involvement of the U.S. war in Ukraine is on a couple of Fox News shows. And the American left is cheering the squad or remaining silent as they send $40 billion more to Ukraine. Now, let's look at what AOC has said over the course of the last 4 years of her career about the kinds of things that she just voted for. Here, in June of 2019, you see from The Hill, the headline, Bernie Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez back, quote, end the forever war pledge. That was when Donald Trump was president. She was very anti-war. End the forever war pledge, she and Bernie Sanders urged. Here in June of 2021, just last year, Ocasio-Cortez slams Congress for, quote, senselessly boosting the defense budget every year. So even with Biden in the first few months of his presidency, she was masquerading as an opponent of inflated increases in the defense budget each year at the expense of the welfare of American citizens. Here she is on the House floor urging support for an anti-imperialism, anti-militarism bill that she had presented. Listen to what she said. This is a mere 6 months ago.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to offer Amendment 40 to reduce the Pentagon budget by 10%. During a time when our country is withdrawing from foreign wars, when COVID-19 and its fallout is one of the greatest threats that we face, when record levels of unemployment, housing, and health care crises are among us, the United States should be reducing its military spending by at least 10% and prioritize the very needs of our communities here at home. Today, we can cut the defense authorization by 10% without any need to deny our service members or their families any of the support that they need. And in doing so, we can free up to $77 billion to go towards fighting the COVID-19 pandemic and much more. Mr. Speaker, I urge support of this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from New York reserves the balance.
So this view in her speech barely caused a ripple because this is just standard left-wing doctrine for decades. The U.S. spends far too much on its military, more than every other country in the world, as I went through. A lot of that is just skimmed and waste. It goes to fill the coffers of Raytheon and Boeing executives so they get $100 million pay packages at the expense of the ordinary American who gets nothing. It causes wars to be fought. It motivates wars because and we need to cut the budget so that we can help Americans. This is standard liberal, left liberal thought for forever until like 2 months ago. This now you only hear from House Republicans under the banner of America First. Why are we going to give all our resources to Ukraine when so many Americans are suffering at home, where the American government, our priority is supposed to be taking care of American citizens, not filling the coffers of Raytheon and the weapons industry and the CIA and helping to fight a war in Ukraine? That was what AOC was saying 6 months ago. You won't hear that from her or any other leftist now. All you hear this from are people on the MAGA movement, on the American right, the 57 House Republicans who just voted no based on this rationale, and a couple of hosts on Fox. Here, when she was running for the Democratic nomination, the unknown AOC, the thing that attracted me to her campaign, this is part of her campaign website and campaign proposal. Quote, in times when we're told that there's not enough money, Republicans and corporate Democrats seem to find the cash to fund a $1.1 trillion fighter jet program or a $1.7 trillion nuclear weapon, quote, modernization program. The costs are extreme. The Pentagon's budget for 2018 is $700 billion, all to continue fighting an endless war on terror and refighting the Cold War with a new arms race that nobody can win. America should not be in the business of destabilizing countries. While we may see ourselves as liberators, the world increasingly views us as occupiers and aggressors. Alexandria believes that we must end the, quote, forever war. Where is that Alexandria now when the Democratic president and the Democratic Party that she pretended she was running to oppose wants to send an amount so mammoth that even the New York Times is alarmed by the lack of questioning and scrutiny and debate over it? She and her squad united with those Democrats, with a large sector of the House Republicans, the pro-war establishment wing of the House Republican caucus, with most of the House Republicans, like Senate Republicans, like I said, like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham and all of those people, Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton, Ben Sasse, all the people who are very traditional advocates of the Reaganite foreign policy that Donald Trump ran against in 2016. This is what she's on board with, a complete reversal of everything she's pretended to believe in for years. And the reason for this is because the Democratic Party can only see the rest of the world through its very stunted, narrow, self-serving partisan prism. In 2016, when Hillary Clinton lost Donald Trump, and the Democrats believed that they were entitled to win that race, that this was the queen that they had been grooming for decades to assume the throne of American power. And a game show host that they regarded as a con man and a fraud beat her. And instead of accepting responsibility because they themselves had nominated one of the most distrusted, disliked, hated political candidates in modern American history in Hillary Clinton, instead of accepting responsibility because their ideology of neoliberalism caused the Democratic Party to collapse under Obama and ushered in Trump, only to then try and run on it in the form of the avatar of neoliberalism and Hillary Clinton, instead of accepting any responsibility, they decided to blame everybody else. WikiLeaks, New York Times, Jill Stein, but especially Putin and Russia. That was the main villain. And so Democrats have been feeding on anti-Russian antipathy and hatred for 6 years now, and this is finally their chance to destroy Russia. Not for any geostrategic reasons. Not because they think they're doing anything to protect Ukraine. How can you think you're protecting Ukraine by pouring $40 billion worth of extremely destructive weaponry onto their soil to ensure that the war lasts years instead of months, while your government is blocking diplomatic attempts to end the war? You're not protecting Ukrainians. You're not fighting for democracy or any of those other things. You're just taking vengeance on a country and a leader that you hate because you believe that he helped the Democratic Party lose an election in 2016 by revealing authentic emails about Hillary Clinton. But whatever else is true, what this shows is that there is no viable anti-war left in the United States. None, zero. It doesn't exist. And anyone who thinks that's hyperbole or anyone who thinks that's an overstatement, I'm willing to listen to arguments like, well, Noam Chomsky and some leftists, actual leftists, are out there saying the opposite of what AOC is saying. They're saying that the policy AOC is supporting and funding is one of the most reckless and dangerous policies the U.S. has pursued in decades. But these are leftists with no political power. The political left in the United States, such that it exists, is Bernie Sanders and AOC and the Squad and the Progressive Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus, all of whom just voted, all of whom, for $40 billion more in what is sure to be an increasingly escalating involvement in a very dangerous war that the United States is now the primary power in terms of fueling. And whatever else you want to say about that, you may agree with it, you may disagree with it. It's a complete abdication of everything the left has ever claimed to believe in. And that's because in 2018 and 2020, the leaders of the left, Bernie Sanders and AOC, told the left that unlike what they had been telling them for years, that it's the Democratic Party and the bipartisan establishment in Washington and the U.S. security state that is their enemy became only one thing and one thing only, Donald Trump and his movement. And therefore, AOC and Bernie instructed their leftist flock, your only ethical duty is to snap into line behind the Democratic Party, to integrate into it, to do your politics within it, and to express your undying and unconditional loyalty to it. And that is all the left is. It's a brand. It's something that podcasters and YouTubers use to kind of distinguish themselves from Rachel Maddow or Chuck Schumer, to let people who are voting Democrat every 2 years like they're told to feel like they're a little bit cooler than their MSNBC watching Pelosi-loving mom. But what it really is just an arm of the Democratic Party. And so whatever the Democratic Party does, the left does as well. And that's why you see the Squad voting for a policy that could not be more antithetical, could not be more violently at odds with the values and ideology and political worldview that they have spent their entire adult lives claiming to believe in.